I'll be back. Something's burning.
Hello everyone, Salim Barahmi here from PIPD. I want to welcome you to another episode of Dardashe. This one is Dardashe Tabee5. Today we're joined by Chef Fadi Kattan, chef and owner of Fawda in Bethlehem. Fadi, welcome and thank you for joining us. We should mention that Fadi is based in Bethlehem, which is the epicenter of the outbreak of the coronavirus in Palestine.
So the hit's been quite bad for the city. So we're not allowed to leave our houses. It's been quite a challenge. I mean, we're in the tourism industry, so it hit us quite quickly and quite badly. Our priority now is simply to be able to stay safe, keep people safe, get a message out to people to stay safe, and then ensure the viability of our staff.
You don't only run a restaurant, but you also run a hotel in Bethlehem on a city that extremely dependent on tourism, and tourism that is trying to survive within occupation. And I think those are challenges that are quite big, and now we're dealing with the pandemic, and it seems that you have been taking on a different approach than what we're used to seeing.
I run a small hotel. We have 12 rooms. We're running tourism under occupation is already a challenge. Running individual tourism in a city that's mainly axed towards massive tourism is a challenge. And then today trying to rethink what is the survival mode and what is the future with the pandemic is a third challenge. Running tourism under occupation for us has become a normal. It's not a normal, but it has become a normal. And it has become a normal which we work in, and we realize that changing our tourism perspective is the key to survival within tourism, and not staying dependent on mass tours that are controlled by Israeli occupation and by tour operators and by the whole story and the lack of Palestinians being able to get their narrative out. On the contrary, we are trying to promote the Palestinian narrative, and food is one of them, but also the tourism aspect. I realized that Palestinians had a training. We have suffered Israeli-imposed curfews and lockdowns over the last 70 years. So seeing people react was quite interesting to see that people were just shifting the enemy. The enemy was no more the Israeli occupation, but it was an unseen virus. But the reflexes were a bit the same. In Palestine, we didn't have a problem of people overbuying toilet paper. People knew what to buy. They bought flour and dried pulses and oil and water. I mean, people had this readiness. And it's quite tricky because it was very good at the beginning, and now it's a bit dangerous because what usually happens when the Israelis impose a curfew on us is after a few weeks, people start being more courageous and going out.
Yeah, it's a scary time because here, in Palestine, our healthcare system is not built to survive an outbreak. And so measures with such as a total curfews are necessary. But yeah, as you say, there's resilience within our DNA, and it's not our first curfew. And I very much commend you for using this time to spread the message and be able to connect with people through Palestinian food. I think it's quite an important source of our history, of our culture, of our story. So I wanted to talk to you about how you came to become a chef and your interest in Palestinian food and your specific take, which is essentially modernizing a bit of Palestinian food in a way.
I'm lucky to have had a fantastic grandmother and to have a great mother who are both excellent cooks and who really taught me this value of sharing with food, of really having food as a message holder. How I became a chef, I basically did a BA in business and then decided to do a master's in hospitality and food. And I fell in love with the kitchen even more, and I specialized in food. And then I worked a bit in Europe, moved back to Palestine for the opening of a hotel. It was just at the beginning of the second Intifada. So we did the opening and the closing of that hotel. And I stayed here, did something very different. And then 5 years ago, started Hosh al-Syrian and Fawda restaurant. Why modernizing Palestinian food? It's because I am fed up of having people think that Palestinian food is hummus and shawarma and falafel. It's way beyond. We have a fantastic heritage of cuisine. We are sadly have been misrepresented both by ourselves and by people stealing our cuisine. We have had a challenge of calling our food Middle Eastern because we were not courageous enough to call it Palestinian, or we thought the markets abroad, and especially abroad, would not accept Palestinian food because of the whole propaganda done by Israel, the whole propaganda done by the world. Actually, in the 70s, you would say you're a Palestinian, people thought you were a terrorist. And I don't blame restaurant owners in the US or in Europe that said we're doing Middle Eastern food to avoid that stigma. But actually, the stigma is not a stigma, it's a pride. We are proud to be Palestinian. And it shouldn't be a stigma, on the contrary. And that's really what motivated me to start modernizing Palestinian food, using Palestinian food or Palestinian produce differently. You know, I'm not doing anything special. I'm doing what every chef does everywhere else in the world except in Palestine, which is to review the tradition. And I think part of why we stuck to tradition is because we felt so much a threat from cultural appropriation, from the occupation, and from our identity. And so we stuck to this tradition, but now it's time to, we don't need another cookbook that talks about how to do hummus. We don't need another cookbook that promotes makluba. Let's do makluba differently. Let's use, today's recipe, and we will talk about it later, I use frika. Frika is Palestinian. It's enough that we do things that suit a certain image of Palestine. Africa is Palestinian. We're proud that Africa is Palestinian. Yes, we're not the largest exporter of Africa today anymore. The Australians plant more Africa than us, plant wheat and use it as Africa. But the identity is totally Palestinian, and we need to reclaim this.
Fadi, that's a very important to make. I think a lot of the time people don't realize that our identity can exist without being relative to another, and usually the relative to another is the Israeli identity and the threat of that on appropriating our food. And there's so much richness and tradition within our food and culture that it's time to celebrate it for what it is, and not compare it to something else.
I don't want to be compared to an Israeli chef. I don't want to have a plate that's compared to an Israeli chef's plate. They are stealing part of our cuisine, yes. When Israeli chefs use laban jamil and call it Israeli parmesan, it's just unacceptable. But it's not unacceptable because we're Palestinians and Israelis and we're under occupation. It's unacceptable because a chef has values, and one of the values is the origin of products. I have no shame saying I use balsamic vinegar from Modena, and I cannot try and say it's balsamic vinegar from Europe. It means nothing. Mm-hmm. They use this very often to say, oh, we're using Palestinian, but they don't say Palestinian, for saying we're using Arab products or Middle Eastern products. Khalas, it's enough. I don't want to have another article that compares me to an Israeli chef and says, oh, but this is resistance. It's not resistance. I'm celebrating my cuisine, my heritage, my identity, and modernizing it and taking the challenge. So today's
one of the ones that frustrates me the most, Fadi, is Jerusalem bagels. They took the ka'ak that is indigenous to Jerusalem and call it Jerusalem bagels. So the nerve.
I think we have a problem with the pride with our products, with our cuisine, and we try and make it look good for the West or look good for the world. No, our products are what they are. Yes, we eat intestines and we eat kashet in Palestine, stuffed stomach. But you know what? Most of Europe does. Why are we ashamed of it? We eat internal organs of animals. Well, yeah, so what? We also have a fantastic vegetarian cuisine. I often see people say, oh, but you're do you do vegetarian food? And I'm like, well, yeah, Palestinians have, if we look at our religious cultural identities, we have two main religious groups in Palestine, Muslims and Christians. Muslims basically go vegetarian for most of Ramadan because the first meal they use to break fast has to be quite light. You fast it for a few hours, so it's a vegetarian option. Christians go vegetarian for the whole of Lent, and they will have vegetarian food the whole period of Lent. Our cuisine is adapted to that.
So I'm excited. What is the recipe for today? What are you cooking for us?
I'm cooking a very easy recipe because I think a lot of people are at home. They're in lockdown. So I've taken the basic staples we usually have in a Palestinian kitchen. And of course, I have a few products that are a bit of an obsession. One of them is Laban Jamid, one of them is sumac, and one of them is frika. So today we're talking about frika and sumac. Frika is this dried wheat. So it's green wheat that's picked early, and you can see frika is a beautiful little grain. It's green wheat that's picked early. It's burnt and then rubbed, and it's called frika. It comes from yufruk, to rub. It has health benefits that are as good and maybe better than quinoa. The difference is it's local. It hasn't traveled 8,000 kilometers. So what we're doing today is a frika salad. Frika, and I'm going to take you step by step, but I'll just tell you what are the ingredients you need. It's frika, chickpeas. So I have the hummus. I've soaked them from last night and cooked them a bit. So they're soft. Dead sea salt, and Dead sea salt is beware. There's one Palestinian producer that does Dead sea salt. Hussam Halal. They've been on the Dead Sea before the creation of Israel, before the annexation of the West Bank, and he's managed to stay there. And his raw salt, so it's salt from the Dead Sea that has not been treated at all, is just fantastic. It's the best salt I've ever used in my life. Sumac, of course, I use sumac, and this sumac comes from the Hebron area. So sumac is an acid, red-brown colored spice. They're little bays, and we're lucky in places where there is sumac, like Palestine. I get them as bays, and then we just grind them when I use them. And then some raisins, some small sultanas, which also come from Bethlehem. They come from the Tqua area. So Tqua is the village that's at the limit of the desert and the Mediterranean landscape. So they're quite sweet, and those I've soaked in a bit of water also. Lemons for lemon juice. Of course, Palestinian recipe, olive oil. You can't do a Palestinian recipe without olive oil.
It's a must.
And then some green onions, a bit of parsley, and a bit of mint. So what we're going to do, and then of course to finish it off and decorate it, pine nuts and almonds, so slivers of them, and we're going to not toast them. Usually in Palestinian cuisine we toast them. Here we're leaving them raw as they are. So what we're going to do is, in a large pot, what you do is you wash the frika, then put it in a pot, cover it with water, get it up to a boil, and once it boils, reduce the heat, and leave it to simmer for around 40 minutes. It still needs to be a bit al dente, so you don't want it mushy, but it needs to be still a bit like whole, because the salad is going to be a nice fresh taste.
Fadi, when I cook frika, something I struggle with, and I'd love to get your advice, is I'll cook it as you say, and then how long should I leave it to steam a bit in the pot?
Once it's cooked, you cover the pot and you leave it for at least 10 minutes because it will absorb the rest of the liquid that's in the pot. It will steam and it will fluff up. Mm-hmm. It's like rice. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's exactly like rice in terms of the cooking. It does take longer time, but it's exactly like rice. Chickpeas, olive oil, Dead Sea salts, sumac, raisins, pine nuts, almonds, some green onions, parsley, and mint.
The cooked frika.
It's extremely easy to do. There's not much to be done. You just need to cook the frika. And with all respect to Salim's talents in cooking, if Salim can cook frika, anybody can cook frika.
That's fair enough. You're underestimating my cooking
That was an
skills.
easy one, Salim. I'm sorry. Shall we?
Yeah.
I'm going to do the chopping now.
Cool.
A bit of the chopping. So we're going to chop the onions, just finely chop them, and then we're going to need around one green onion if they're nice and fresh. One is good enough. Don't use the whole thing. You just use a third of the green bits. The rest, if you're home and you're doing a stock, throw it into your stock. I do believe a lot in zero waste, and we try and not discard anything in the kitchen. So
Great.
we keep.
Fadi, I wanted to ask you, as you chop a bit, Palestine is quite a rich country, and it has a lot of different microclimates, and we have amazing ingredients that I think the world doesn't know about. Would you be able to tell us about some of those ingredients, what you use mostly in your cooking, and you see a lot in cooking?
I use a lot of Palestinian herbs. I use a lot of our grains. Our herbs are fantastic because we have such different microclimates here that you have a bit of herbs that grow in the desert or in oases in the desert, like khubeza from Jericho, like borage, which is called wara al-Syrian from the Mediterranean hills. I use most of these herbs. There's a fantastic herb that grows up in the north of the West Bank called loof, which is actually a poisonous herb. And Palestinians have been cooking it for hundreds of years with a way where you get rid of that poisonous, but it leaves a tingling on your lips. And it's quite interesting. And then recently I found a herb which I knew nothing about in the Tiberias and Nazareth area called mu'ra. I mean, that's really what's beautiful with Palestine. You have all these little different microclimates, and they all have fantastic stuff happening. We put in the herbs, so the onions, the mint, the parsley, the green onions, a bit of sumac, olive oil, a bit of the salt, like a nice pinch of salt, and you just twirl all of this. You add some of the frika into it. And again, you mix well. Some of the chickpeas.
As people now are spending more times at home, maybe cooking much more, what are other Palestinian dishes that they could make?
مقلوبة, مسخن, hummus, bean stews. We have such a varied cuisine. There's so much you can do at home. We do a lot of stuff with dough, with pastry. سفيحة, sambusa, خبز بزعتر, خبز بالسرانة. I mean, just my advice is grab your computer, look at Palestinian food, or listen to my podcast. I'm putting up a recipe every 2 days. And actually, funnily enough, because of the confinement and the sense of wanting to go back to something that's a bit of a comfort food, on the podcast, I'm only doing traditional Palestinian recipes. I'm not doing the modern touches of my cuisine. It's really this feeling of wanting to be back at the base, because you need that base to be a bit in comfort. So our salad is ready. Our recipe is ready. Everything has been combined, well coated with olive oil, sumacs all over, Once you've plated it, you just add a bit more sumac because that's what I love doing, and you just enjoy it. It's an easy to do recipe. You can actually do it in advance and keep it in your fridge overnight. It's healthy, fresh. I mean, that's a basic Palestinian dish you can do at home. Doesn't need much work, and it's really tasty. And every mouthful you'll have should send you to a bit of sunny Palestine.
Can you tell people where they can find your recipes and get a bit more learn more about Palestinian food and the work you do?
I have an Instagram page, a Facebook page, a website, which is www.fadikattan.com. And the podcast now is available on Spotify, on iTunes, and on Podbean. And it's called Sabah al-Yasmin, Ramblings of a Chef. And there's a new episode every day. So one day it's a Palestinian recipe, and one day is an interview with a colleague, with a chef. Mainly asked around Arab food in general, but specifically Palestinian.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us today, Fadi. It's been an absolute pleasure.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you so much.